Basic information. Let's talk about some basic information about C# before we actually get coding. So the first thing I want to talk about are data types. So we need to tell the computer exactly what type of data we're going to be working with. And data types in C# usually fall into about three categories: numbers, alphanumerics, and states. Okay, so let's talk about the numbers first. There's usually two types of numbers that we work with. We work with whole numbers, or we work with numbers that have decimals in them. So let's talk about the whole numbers first. And we got a variety of choices on this. So if we're dealing with numbers that have a value between 0 and 255, we can use the byte data type. Okay. Now, if we want to use a number that's a whole number that's greater than 255 but less than 32,000, we'll probably want to use a short. If we have a whole number that has a value greater than 32,000 or up to a value past 32,000, we may want to use the data type of int. An int can hold a number up to about approximately 2 billion. Now, if you've got a number greater than 2 billion, then we want to use the long data type. So if we look up here, that's a pretty long, big number. What I want to point off to you here on the right hand side here, you'll notice that these are like 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit. Okay, this is the physical size of how that number is taking up. So if we talk about an 8-bit number, we're talking about in memory, in space, an 8-bit number is going to be 8 ones and zeros. Okay, if we're talking about a 16-bit integer, we're talking about a number that has 16 ones and zeros. Okay, so we can see physically that this number is going to be physically bigger than this number here. It's going to be twice the size, and this number is going to be twice the size as that physically. Okay. Now you're saying, well, wait a minute. I want to deal with numbers that have decimal points in them. So we have two data types that deal with those. We have floats and we have doubles. Okay, now a float will take a number approximately 3.4 times 10 to the 38th power. Okay, so that's 3.4 with 38 zeros behind it. That's a pretty big number. But let's say we're working on a project there that maybe for the space program where we're dealing with really huge numbers. So a double would be the ideal data type. So that has 1.7 times 10 to the 308th power. Okay, so we're talking about a number that has 308 zeros behind it. Big number. Okay, so if we're dealing with numbers with decimal points, we're going to either use float or double. But you're saying, wait a minute, I want to deal with text, I want to deal with alphanumerics. Okay, so we have two data types that can deal with that. We have chars and we have strings. Okay, so what's the difference? Chars will always be a set length. So we always set a char data type to a specific length, and it will always stay that specific length. So for instance, if we want to store postal codes, which are 2 characters, we can set a char to be a length of 2, and it will always be 2. If we set a char to be a width of 10, and we only put 2 characters in it, the char will still hold out the 8 empty spaces for it. Okay, it will always be a width of whatever we set it. Now a string is variable length. It will only take up as much room as what it needs. Okay, so if we're storing Mississippi, Mississippi's around 9 characters long. Okay, the first time we store it, Mississippi will be 9 characters. If we go back and store Ohio in it, it will only take up 4 characters. So strings are variable length. So strings in C# can hold up about 1 billion characters. So if we wanted to take one of the works of Shakespeare and store it in a string variable, we could easily do that. It's got a physical max of approximately about 2 gigabytes. So if we're dealing with alphanumerics, letters, numbers, symbols, we can store them in a char or in a string. And then we have the bools. It's short for Boolean. Okay, that means we're testing to see whether something is true or false, whether it's running or not. Okay, so if we're checking for the state of something. So a Boolean will allow us to do that. So what do we want to take away from this? When we start to look at our data that we need to manipulate, we need to determine exactly what kind of data we're going to be working with, and we need to assign the appropriate data type to that. And when it comes to numbers, we have choices. We're either going to deal with the whole numbers which allows us to go from byte to long. Or if we're going to be dealing with numbers with decimal places in them, we're looking at floats and doubles. If we're dealing with alphanumerics, we're looking at chars and strings. And if we need to check the state of something, we're looking at the booleans. Okay, let's move on for a little bit here and talk about variables. Variables are the box, that's going to be the unit that we actually store our data in. Okay, so there's a couple things about variables. First off, they must start off with a letter. Okay, you cannot start a variable name off with a number. It has to be a letter. They can include special characters, letters, and numbers, okay? But they always start off with a letter. And I like to stay away from the special characters. Usually the underscore and the dash are accepted, but I would usually, as practice, stay away from all the other ones, especially periods, pound signs, etc. on that. In most languages on that, you keep the variable names to less than 256 characters, and you want to make them descriptive. Okay, so don't create a variable up there and call it I. Okay, I mean, it's not very descriptive on it. If I stands for interest rate, then call the variable name interest rate. Don't call it I, because other people will eventually have to read your code. So you want to make those variable names very descriptive. Now I've got some examples down here. So like here we have, we're declaring a variable int age, and we're going to store ages in this variable. Here we've got a variable here that's going to store salary, and we're going to initialize this to initially to have 30,000. Here I have another variable that's going to store a first name, and here I've initialized it to store Jim. Now I have one here, it's called state. Okay, we're going to store postal codes, and here we're going to store MT in that. I got another one here. We've initialized the value to 65,000. And the bottom one here we're showing 0. Now you notice the pattern. It's the data type followed by the variable name. Okay, so data type followed by the variable name. And then it's usually good practice to initialize the variables, give it an initial value. So if you're dealing with numbers on that, a lot of times you set their initial value to 0. That's good practice. Other things I want to point out to you, strings, they're usually enclosed by double quotes, and chars are usually enclosed by single quotes. Now, let's talk a little bit more about some coding basics. First off, C# is case sensitive. Okay, so you have to watch that. It's case sensitive. If you've got something in uppercase, it has to match. All statements end in a semicolon. Okay, so when we're done with a statement on there, a line of code that needs to be executed, we'll end it in a semicolon. And then we're going to put our codes in coding blocks. Okay, and that's usually a coding block is defined by a left and right brace. So those are some basic things, structure of what we're going to see when we get into programming our C# programs. Now the most important thing about coding is commenting your code, okay? Because you want to leave notes in there for yourself and for the people who follow you who have to maintain that code. So if you need to comment a single line, we do it with 2 slashes. If we've got a multiple line comment, like we want to write a paragraph or something like on that, we start it off with a /*. We can put in our lines of code, and we end it with a //. Okay, so multiple lines, you start it with this, and then you end it with that, with the //. One other thing here, I'm going to talk real briefly on this, and we'll get more into this later, is escape sequences. So basically, when these deal specifically with strings, so how do you put like a new line in a string, or how do you show a quote in a string if it's enclosed in quotes? Okay, this is where the escape sequences come into play. So if we actually wanted to put a new line within our string, we can do a /n. If we wanted to put some spaces between some words, we can use a /t. If we wanted to show a double quote, we would actually do a /quote. Or if we actually wanted to show one backslash, then we would do 2 backslashes. Okay, so these are escape characters. We're going to talk a little bit about those more later. But I just wanted to give you some basic information about C Sharp before we actually started getting into our coding process. So that's some basic information on C Sharp.